Welcome to a question and answer episode of the Old Frontline podcast. In these bonus episodes, we'll answer the questions that you pose out of the episodes that we release each week. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast via your favourite platform, and do think about leaving us a review or a star rating. So let's get down to this week's questions. Welcome to our first question and answer bonus episode for Season 7. We're kind of catching up on some of the questions that were sent in during Season 6. It's proving a very popular aspect of what we're doing with the podcast now, and something that I will definitely be continuing with throughout this season and hopefully beyond. Hopefully it's become part of what the podcast does. It's clear that you've got a lot of questions that you want to ask, that you want answers to, and it's a real pleasure for me to sit down and answer them for you. And I think it helps us discuss some of the kind of smaller aspects of the Great War, but it also helps us to kind of go off topic in a way that we might not do with a main episode, and shine light on a lot of different angles or layers, as we often call them, on this podcast. So we're going to get down to our questions for this week, and as usual we'll kind of stick to 4 questions, which I think works pretty well in the context of a 20 to 30 minute episode. So our first question is from Andrew Caesar Gordon, received on email. The first question you answered this week mentioned the old contemptibles. My question is, does anyone know how many of the original 90,000 strong BEF actually survived the whole war? You talked of the original BEF of regulars being almost wiped out by the end of 1914. Were you just referring to the original 90,000 troops in the first wave in August? I understand that 145,000 men applied for and received the 1914 Star Medal after the war, and there must have been many others who didn't bother applying for a medal. This required them to have served between the 4th of August and the end of December 1914 within range of enemy artillery. Many of those awarded a medal would have been part of that second wave of reinforcements. But is there any way of knowing how many of the original BEF survived the whole war? Well, that's a great question. Let me just address 1 or 2 of the points in your question there. So the Old Contemptibles was a name given to the soldiers who were part of that original British Expeditionary Force. There was an Old Contemptibles Association after the war. It was a kind of nickname. It was said that either the Kaiser or perhaps one of the German generals like von Kluck, Old 1 o'clock, the British soldiers called him, they had said that the British Army, whoever it was, had said that the British Army was a contemptible little army. Now, if that was ever said, it was certainly taken as a badge of pride, and they became known as the Old Contemptibles. The original BEF consisted of 6 infantry divisions backed up with cavalry, artillery, engineers and everything else. I think it was probably just a little bit above 90,000. Probably about that many landed in the first wave in August, with a couple of the divisions arriving late on after Mons and Le Cateau to join the BEF on the Aisne, and then some other divisions would arrive in time for the first Battle of Ypres, and then some others would join during the winter of 1914-15. In terms of the 1914, often called the Mons Star, that's its unofficial name, a bit like the Old Contemptibles. Its official military name was the 1914 Star. That was issued to soldiers who actually served overseas from the 5th of August until the 22nd of November 1914, so not until the end of December. If you landed in France after the 22nd of November 1914, you got the 1914-15 Star, which was similar shape medal, but it didn't have those key dates on it. And in fact, there were over 365,000 1914 stars issued to men who had served, whether they were in the Army, in the Royal Flying Corps, or were members of the Royal Naval Division, for example, who served up at Antwerp in that October 1914 period. And some women awarded the 1914 Star, a figure for the exact number of bars, or clasps as it's often referred to as, which was for being under fire or within sound of enemy gunfire, is not a figure that I've seen really kind of an accurate number for. But if you were in an infantry battalion serving in one of those battles from Mons to Le Cateau to the Aisne, the Marne, and the First Battle of Ypres, then you almost certainly would have had the bar or the clasp to your medal. If you were serving in the field bakery at Rouen, hundreds of miles behind the front at different points, then you weren't going to get the clasp to it. So it was very much an indicator of whether a man had truly been on the battlefield. The clasp was loose and had to be sewn onto the ribbon. There was a rosette to wear on your line of ribbons that you'd wear on a tunic to indicate you'd been awarded the bar or the clasp. But many soldiers did just go into tailors after the war and buy them, veterans. And I've got medals to men who were not awarded the clasp, who have the clasp on it or have the rosette. They kind of felt left out. And perhaps the exact criteria for it wasn't entirely explained to them at the time. But to come back to your kind of fundamental question, when we look at these men of the regular army, and I use that phrase, I think was probably prompted this, the red little dead little army. And that's a phrase that Henry Williamson uses in a couple of his books. The Red Army being, of course, the old regular army with the scarlet tunics they wore for ceremonials. And the fact that by the end of 1914, that army of over 365,000 men, of mainly regulars, but towards the end of that 1914 qualification period for the Mons Star, in inverted commas, these were increasingly reservists, as you've mentioned, and also territorial. So territorial units like the London Scottish, the Queen Victoria Rifles, Queen's Westminster Rifles, the Liverpool Scottish, the Hertfordshire Regiment. These were units that came over during that period and also qualified in the kind of last weeks of that qualification period at the tail end of the First Battle of Ypres for the medal. So it was a mixed bag of men, not just pre-war regular soldiers, but men who'd been on the reserve for a long time and recalled and sent over as reinforcements, and then latterly entire part-time battalions of part-time soldiers from what was then the territorial force, or the territorial army as it became after the war. So how many men survived from those 365,000? Now that is a question I can't answer. I don't think there's ever been a figure on that, or it would take a mammoth amount of research to go through the medal rolls and kind of quantify that data to draw any kind of conclusion. But we have some photographic evidence. There's a much lauded photograph that Andrew Thornton, who was a guest on this podcast some time ago, who's a specialist in the 1914 campaign. There's a photograph of men of a Scottish regiment standing within the shadow of their depot, the entire battalion on parade, and then a small handful of men, and that apparently shows how many were left at the end of the war. When you analyse that picture, it's a fake. It's the same photograph, and they've just been photoshopped to take a chunk of men out to what people think were the number of survivors. And it's not based on any kind of evidence for that unit. What we do have instead, though, are group photographs. So there's a fantastic book called The War the Infantry Knew about the 2nd Battalion Royal Welsh Fusiliers by Dr. Dunn, who was the medical officer. And in the reprint of that came out in the 1980s, because it was a very difficult book to get in a first edition. I don't have a first edition, only the reprint. There was a photograph of that battalion on parade before going to France, something like 1,100 officers and men, and then a photograph of the survivors still serving with the battalion at the armistice in November 1918. And it was about 20 men of all ranks. Now that doesn't mean that over 1,000 men were killed and that these 20 are the only survivors, because if you think of the nature of how soldiers serve and what happens to them, in those battles of 1914 alone, men were killed, buried on the battlefield, or were missing. Men were wounded and went back to hospitals. Sometimes the wound was so critical they couldn't serve again. Other times they recovered from that wound and then returned to their battalion perhaps to be killed or wounded again. Others transferred to other units. With the formation of the Machine Gun Corps in 1915, men who'd been in the machine gun sections of regular battalions in 1914 frequently became MGC soldiers. Men with specialist skills joined the sappers. Men were medically downgraded and became drivers in the Army Service Corps, or ended up in rear echelon duties in other regiments or corps of the Army. Men were commissioned and became officers. There's all kinds of explanations, so we can't put a figure on it. But if you're talking about men who were serving when the battalion landed in France and were still serving in that unit at the end of the war, the numbers are going to be like that photograph of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. You're talking about tens of men who may have still been serving. And that doesn't mean they've never been wounded, never been sick, never been promoted, never done anything. It just means they were, by virtue of fate, still there at war's ending. So I can't answer this in terms of actual statistics, but you can imagine that your chances of surviving from 1914 through to 1918 as a regular infantry soldier or as an officer, where casualty rates were much higher, particularly for junior officers, was potentially quite slim. And some soldiers survived by virtue of being wounded multiple times. So my Uncle Dan Boyles, was a pre-war regular in the 2nd Battalion, the Essex Regiment. He fought in the retreat from Mons at Le Cateau on the Aisne and the Marne, and then moved up to Ypres. He was wounded at Ypres in early 1915 with shrapnel. Then he was sent home, rejoined his depot, was posted to the 1st Battalion in Gallipoli, was shot through the elbow by a Turkish sniper while drinking a cup of tea in the Crithia vineyard, went to Mudros, then returned to his unit, served with them in Egypt, and then was wounded with machine gun fire through the legs on the first day of the Somme, recovered from that, and then he was gassed in the end of 1917 with the 11th Essex, and that brought his war on the Western Front as an infantry soldier to an end. He was medically downgraded, and he was transferred to the Labour Corps. So that's kind of one little example, one of many examples I can think of off the top of my head, but it kind of shows you just the chances of going through the war, surviving the war, was pretty slim without any kind of wound or sickness. But there were men. I mean, there were men in jobs that were, even in an infantry battalion, quite safe. If you were in the transport section bringing up the supplies, that was obviously a safer job, if any job in the Great War could be ever described as safe. So I can't answer that, and I think it's one of the kind of virtues, really, of researching individual units, taking a unit, looking at the statistics, and then drawing some conclusions from that. You can do that quite easily now with medal rolls. They're all available online, and you can kind of go through those and pull out this kind of data and come to some conclusion. But in terms of the medal itself, going back to its title of the Mons Star, you quite rightly hint at that the majority of the expeditionary force are men who had never served at Mons. So although the medal bore that name of the first British battle of the Great War, the majority of those more than 365,000 soldiers who got the Mons Star, the 1914 Star, its official name, had never been anywhere near Mons. They had arrived as replacements for the Battle of Mons, the retreat from Mons, Le Cateau, and the fighting in that ground east of Paris. And the majority of men with that decoration had actually fought in the first Battle of Ypres in October and November of 1914. But it's a medal that has great symbolism and is a very powerful medal that links us to a very specific period of the war. And I remember as a teenager buying my first Mons Star in a junk shop to Private Albert Buckle of the 2nd Battalion, the Queen's Regiment, who was killed on the Bellewaerde Ridge at Zonnebeek in October 1914. And I still have that medal today. His name is on the Menin Gate at Ypres, and when that reopens, he'll be one of the first that I'll go and see to look at those panels once more in the refurbished memorial as it approaches its centenary. So a great question, one that I don't entirely have an answer to, but we've kind of danced around the houses talking about different aspects of what that period of the war can mean and what we can glean from the survivability within that red little dead little army. Question number 2 comes from Joe in Canada, also via email. Why were the Canadian troops called stormtroops or shock troops by the Germans during the Great War? Well, Joe, you're obviously very proud of the achievements of the Canadian Army, the Canadian Expeditionary Force in the Great War, and so am I. It's been something that has interested me for a very, very long time. I lived on a Canadian battlefield, Courcelette. I interviewed a Canadian veteran, Lance Casamol, who served in the 2nd Canadian Division on the Somme in 1916. I've collected memoirs and regimental and unit histories to the Canadians. They are of particular interest to me, and in some of the battlefield archaeology that I've been involved in, I was very proud and honoured to help recover the body of a Canadian soldier from Courcelette back in the 1990s, enabling him to be kind of brought out of the cold and properly reburied. But in terms of the Canadian battle performance in the First World War, there have been some recent publications in the last couple of decades about this, some of which I think have been quite balanced, perhaps others less balanced. It's clear that the Canadians were a formidable fighting force. The achievements of the 1st Canadian Division in stopping the Germans at Ypres in 1915, of units like the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry in that last stand on the 8th of May 1915 at Bellewaerde, those are without doubt incredible chapters in Canadian military history. But once the Canadian Corps was formed with 4 Canadian divisions, with men who enlisted at the very beginning of the war, the eager volunteers who'd flocked to Canadian recruitment centres to join the CEF, but then there were other men who'd kind of joined later on, perhaps less enthusiastic, or perhaps an opportunity to enlist had not been readily available in their part of Canada. So the kind of difference in those early volunteers to some of the later ones, and of course within a few years there would be conscription in Canada, and the whole nature of the Canadian soldiers that served on the Western Front would be very, very different. You're seeing a changing army, and you're seeing an army by the time of the Battle of the Somme in 1916, when the Canadian Corps goes over the top for the first time in the attack on Courcelette village on the 15th of September 1916, an army that is largely untried. There are veterans within it from the 1st and 2nd Canadian Divisions who'd served in the Second Battle of Ypres and the battles of the Saint-Loire craters at Ypres in 1916, for example. But most of these men, this was their first time in action. This is really where they kind of learned a lot of the lessons on the Somme in 1916. But in terms of the command structure, with its divisional commanders, including at this stage, he's not commanding the whole Canadian forces, that's Arthur Currie, he's a divisional commander, he learns lessons from the Somme, and the overall corps commander, Julian Byng, is a British officer, much respected by the Canadians. He would go on to become Governor-General of Canada after the war. This was their kind of proving ground, the Somme, that led to them applying those lessons to the approach to battle at Vimy in April 1917, and then in some of the later fighting at Hill 70 in August and at Passchendaele, a very different kind of battle experience in the mud and the muck and the slime of the Third Battle of Ypres. But for me, where you see the real triumph of Canadian arms in the Great War is not at Vimy. It's not in that great battle that dominates the collective memory of the Canadians of the Great War. It's in the last 100 days, when that Canadian Corps, now led by Arthur Currie, greatly respected, a forthright, very determined commander who gave a lot of leeway to junior officers beneath him to develop the way the Canadian Corps fought its battles. You're seeing the development, as with British and Australian, New Zealand, South African forces around them, you're seeing the development of a wider modern army, and the Canadians very much a part of that. Not entirely leading the way, but certainly adding a lot to the knowledge base of how those battles should be fought to achieve victory. And of course, many may point to the fact that the Canadians are pretty much constantly fighting in those last 100 days of the war, from the 8th of August to the 11th of November. Why is that? Is it because they're so good? Well, There is an element of that, but there's also a kind of selfish side when it comes to the British Expeditionary Force, is that the British Army had reduced the size of its units in early 1918 from 12 infantry battalions to 9. The CEF did not do that, so a Canadian Infantry Division had 12 battalions, plus a lot more engineers and pioneers and artillery behind it, and machine guns and motorised machine guns that gave it a lot of firepower. So there was no accident that the Canadians were in the vanguard, the tip of the spear of the assault in those last 100 days. And in that period, incredibly, those 4 Canadian divisions fought over 50 German divisions in the field. I think an unparalleled achievement or record in terms of the wider British and Empire arms on the Western Front during the Great War. So there is no evidence to my mind that the Germans ever used that phrase shock troops in terms of the Canadians, or that they feared them. In the last Q&A we spoke about how the Germans graded divisions, and 2 of the Canadian divisions they rated highly, and 2 of them they didn't. But yet when I look at those 2 Canadian divisions, the 4th Canadian Division being a good example of that, it had a really exemplary fighting record in those last 100 days. So it's difficult to quantify this kind of stuff, but what is there for sure is that the pages of Canadian history were written large during those years of 1914-18, but in particular, in my mind, in those last 100 days. That was the greatest achievement of Canadian arms in that conflict on the Western Front, when an army made up of men with experience, with a huge amount of conscripts, recently joined soldiers, under the commands of those men with experience, and led by good generals and a good corps commander in Arthur Currie, achieved that great victory and continued fighting for 100 days from the 8th of August to the very last shots, when George Lawrence Price, a soldier of the 28th Canadian Infantry, was shot through the chest in the streets of Mons and died 2 minutes before the armistice came into effect. Canada and its armed forces and the men of the CEF is something we've discussed many times on this podcast and will return to again for sure. Question number 3 comes from Jim Hastings, also on email. You have researched so many actions and units, interviewed and befriended so many Great War veterans, and I wondered if this has drawn you to a favourite battalion and or division that you are now always drawn to when you come across them in your research or explore the old front line. If so, what ones are they and why? Well, I mentioned how the Canadians in that previous question had been a kind of lifelong interest of mine in terms of the history of the Great War. But more than that, having been born in Sussex and spent the first chunk of my life in that county, and coming across war memorials and war graves in Sussex churchyards and finding individual memorials, and at a time when the junk shops of Sussex were full of the memorabilia of the Great War, and finding photographs and letters and diaries and medals and memorial plaques to Sussex men. The Royal Sussex Regiment in particular is one that I've studied. I think it's very good for Great War historians to pick a regiment, do a lot of research on it for the reasons that I spoke about in the first question about the 1914 campaign. It gives you a kind of way into how the British Army operated, and you can use examples from within that regiment to help explain kind of wider situations in different periods of the conflict. And the Royal Sussex, a county regiment, not a particularly big one, is a good example of this. It had battalions that served in multiple theatres of war, not just France and Flanders, but Gallipoli and Palestine and Russia, and it kind of gives you an opportunity to look into those aspects of the Great War as well. So the Royal Sussex Regiment is something, whenever I'm in a cemetery, I'm always looking out for the Roussillon, the plume of the regiment just above the garter of the cap badge, or the 5th Battalion, the Cinque Ports Battalion, has its own special badge. I look out for that too. But even within that regiment, there are 3 battalions which are kind of like my Great War lodestars when it comes to a unit in the Great War, and that's the 11th, 12th and 13th Royal Sussex Regiment. They were the 1st, 2nd and 3rd Southdowns Battalions, formed in 1914 by Claude Lowther MP, who lived in Hurstmonceux Castle. He drew in men from all over Sussex, from the east, from the west, from the county towns and the villages, men who were clerks, men who worked in businesses, on the railway and all kinds of things, as well as in the open fields of the Southdowns or in the small confines of agricultural communities all over the county of Sussex. It very much represented Sussex as a county. And I came across them by seeing a date that would appear on war memorials or on private memorials frequently, the 30th of June 1916. What was that date? What had happened on that day? It wasn't mentioned in official histories. And that became, as one of the veterans that I subsequently interviewed, Albert Bamfield, he called it the day Sussex died. On that day, those 3 battalions attacked the Boar's Head near Richbourg and lost over 360 men killed and 1,100 wounded. So it was a devastating, devastating day for Sussex. Over 77 towns and villages were affected by the dead alone. And in that period of the 1980s, when I began to look into this, I essentially stumbled across the last veterans of this battalion. So interviewed quite a lot of men who had served with the 11th and the 12th and the 13th, and came across diaries and first-hand accounts. So it is a battalion, a series of battalions that I know very, very well indeed, and ones that I'm drawn back to again and again. I was thinking just the other day after my last trip to the battlefields, where we kind of followed a journey from the coasts towards the front line, how I'm going to do something very similar for the podcast with the Southdowns Battalions in their journey from arriving in France to the point where they go into action at the Boar's Head in that day that Sussex died. It is something that I've spoken about in the podcast before, but I think revisiting these stories and telling them in a slightly different way, particularly by doing it on the actual ground and recording it on the actual ground, kind of gives, yet again, one of those new kind of layers to the subject. So I hope, Jim, that kind of answers your question. I don't think that'll be a surprise to you, as I know you're a Sussex man yourself, but I think being drawn to the lads from good old Sussex by the sea has helped me understand so many aspects of the First World War through the eyes of those lambs, of those Southdown boys from all over Sussex. Our fourth and final question comes from Andy Gale on email. Now, this can hardly be expected to elicit a definitive response and is more to do with asking you what your own views and opinions are. So quite simply, are there enough memorials on the old Western Front, and do we need any more? I'd be interested in your views. Well, in the interwar period, obviously across the battlefields of what became the old front line, memorials were placed on key sites. New nations that had stepped onto the world stage for the first time. We've already mentioned the Canadians in this episode. That's a good example of it. They wanted to memorialise their dead, and Canadian memorials were placed on all the battlefield sites where they'd fought. Australian divisions placed memorials on the sites where their troops had fought. The New Zealand division did the same. The South Africans purchased Delville Wood and constructed a memorial there. And within units of the British Army, they had to apply for permission to build a memorial, and not every division either did that or was successful, so not every unit of the army was memorialised on the battlefields. There are some famous ones, the famous bronze Tommy looking down the main street of Flers, which commemorates the men of the 41st Division on the Somme, for example. There are lesser-known memorials, drinking troughs that commemorate divisions, little plaques on the side of cemetery walls, but these are all contemporary memorials built by old comrades associations. We've spoken before about the link between the establishment of an old comrades association and the publication of a divisional history or a unit history and the placing of a memorial on the battlefields. But these, as I say, they're contemporary memorials. Now, nothing was placed on the Western Front or any other Great War battlefield, to my knowledge, after 1939 in terms of those directly involved in it putting a memorial there. So there wasn't some memorials that were kind of waiting to be built in 1939 that weren't, and then were put in place after World War II. Memorialisation like that of units, of communities and so on pretty much stops with the Second World War and didn't start again until the 1990s. The odd plaque went up here and there to commemorate a particular person. I remember seeing some things fixed to trees in different places on the Somme in the 1980s and 90s. But I think as interest in the Great War grew, people with very good intentions were keen to memorialise forgotten chapters, as they saw it, of the Great War, units that had perhaps been neglected. I remember Bill Turner, the author of the Accrington Pals, helping to fund and then erect the memorial to the Accrington Pals in what is the Sheffield Memorial Park, which is a broken wall made of Accrington brick on a base. And that kind of, I think, spurned a new generation of ideas and of people stepping forward to kind of do the same. And if you go into the Sheffield Memorial Park now, amongst the original memorials that are in there, there are a lot of more recent ones as well, including one to the lads from Barnsley. I've taken people from Barnsley when I lived there to see that memorial to the 13th and 14th York and Lancaster Regiment who went over the top there on the first day of the Somme and in the subsequent battle in November 1916 as well. So those kind of memorials have grown and grown. And there are some very good memorials on the battlefields. There is the Black Watch Soldier, Black Watch Corner, fantastic bronze that went up in 2014, a decade ago, to commemorate that. And there is the Red Dragon, Mametz Wood, that looks down Death Valley towards the Hammerhead. That was put up in the 1980s on the wishes of some veterans. So there's a kind of contemporary involvement there. But where does it stop? I mean, if you go to Normandy, there are memorials to almost everything. And this year being the 80th anniversary year, no doubt there will be some new ones put in place. Will we get to a point in Normandy? Will we get to a point on the First World War battlefields where people will think, you know, we've kind of had enough of this, particularly French and Belgian people. We don't need any memorials. But yet we can point to, particularly in Belgium, communities there have erected their own memorials to Indian troops, to Welsh troops, to Scottish troops on different parts of the Flanders landscape. That's less common in France, but it has happened in one or two locations. And I think the memorialisation is important. It kind of focuses, it creates new beacons to the Great War. And you could get to a point where you could say, look, we kind of don't need any of these anymore. But we've got to recognise that the Great War continues to inspire people, draws people in. And a century from now, it will still be doing that. And who's to say what a generation 100 years from now would want to do to memorialise aspects of the Great War that have never been memorialised. So I've kind of got an open mind when it comes to that. I'm not over-sensitive to new memorials. But one thing I kind of don't want to see is a repeat of what happened at Pozieres with the kind of dreadful arrangement of a memorial site there that needed, politely, a lot more thought going into it than it eventually did have, although that's beginning to blend more into the landscape now. So it's right to memorialise, it's right to think about this, but we need to have, in many respects, perhaps practical memorials that commemorate something rather than just a statue or an obelisk or a plaque on a wall. What can we do to more practically remember an aspect of the First World War? And I don't have an exact answer to that. So we'll end there on the Old Front Line itself. Keep those questions coming, and we'll see you soon for another bonus episode looking at questions and answers of the Great War. And remember, you can send them in via the Discord server or via email, and links to both of those are in the show notes. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps, You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline.